A horse ran through a burning forest to save its herd. What happened next was pure heroism. The forest had always been a sanctuary for the herd of wild horses, a sprawling maze of towering trees, bubbling streams, and hidden clearings where sunlight kissed the earth. It was a place of safety, abundance, and freedom. But that morning, everything changed. Ash, a young stallion with a coat as dark as a stormy sky, felt the shift before it happened. A low, acrid wind carried an unfamiliar warning through the forest. His ears flicked forward, and his nostrils flared as he caught the faint scent of smoke. He wasn't the leader of the herd. Granite, the seasoned and steady alpha stallion, held that role. But Granite was older now, his steps slower, and his instincts less sharp. Ash trotted toward the edge of the clearing where the herd grazed peacefully, unaware of the creeping danger. His best friend, a playful mare named Ember, followed close behind. "Why the rush, Ash?" she asked, her voice teasing. But when she saw the tension in his posture, her tone softened. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Ash replied, his voice low. "But something isn't right." As if summoned by his unease, a sudden gust of hot wind swept through the forest, carrying with it the unmistakable crackle of flames. Panic erupted like thunder. Birds took to the sky in flocks, their cries echoing through the treetops. Ash turned back toward the clearing, his heart pounding. Smoke billowed in the distance, turning the sky an ominous shade of gray. The herd's ears pricked up, and their head darted in every direction, searching for the source of the danger. Then Granite stepped forward, his once mighty frame marked by age and a slight limp in his right hind leg. "Stay calm," Granite commanded, his voice gruff but steady. "We've faced storms and predators. We'll face this too." But Ash wasn't so sure. This was no predator they could outrun, no storm they could simply wait out. The fire was alive, roaring and devouring everything in its path. He watched the flames licking closer, devouring the dry underbrush that lined the forest floor, and felt a pit of dread settle in his stomach. Granite's usual decisiveness faltered. The old stallion scanned the chaos, his injured leg trembling under the weight of his responsibility. "We'll head for the river," he announced after a pause, nodding toward the east. "It's our safest bet." But Ash knew better. The river was too far, and the fire's speed was relentless. It would overtake them before they reached safety. His instincts screamed at him to speak up. But who was he to challenge Granite's authority? He was just a restless stallion who had never known the weight of leadership. The herd began to move as Granite barked orders, guiding them toward the east. Ash hesitated, his gaze darting between the growing flames and his retreating herd. Every fiber of his being told him Granite was leading them into a trap. "Wait!" Ash shouted, his voice breaking through the panicked neighs. "We can't outrun the fire heading east. The wind's against us." Granite turned, his brow furrowing at the interruption. "The river's our best chance, Ash," he replied, his tone firm. "The cliffs to the north," Ash said quickly, stepping forward. "They're rocky and open. The fire won't have enough fuel to follow us there." The herd fell silent, their eyes shifting between the two stallions. Granite's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ash thought he would be reprimanded for speaking out. But then Granite sighed, the weight of his years visible in his weary eyes. "Lead them," Granite said, stepping aside. "If you're wrong, we won't have another chance." Ash's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Granite to concede, and the weight of the herd's survival settled on his shoulders like an iron yoke. But there was no time to doubt himself. The flames were closing in. "Follow me!" Ash neighed, his voice strong and clear. He took off at a gallop, leading the herd toward the cliffs. Ember stayed close, her fiery mane streaming behind her like a beacon. The terrain grew steeper, the smoke thicker, but Ash pressed on, guiding the herd through narrow trails and rocky slopes. The foals stumbled, their mothers urging them forward with desperate whinnies. Then came the first casualty. A young colt caught his hoof in a hidden root and fell, his cries of pain piercing through the air. Ash skidded to a stop, his hooves sending dirt flying. He turned back, his heart racing. "Keep going!" Granite shouted from the rear. "I'll stay with him." Ash's instincts screamed to help, but he knew Granite was right. If the herd stopped, they'd all be lost. He locked eyes with the colt, his heart breaking, but he forced himself to look away and continue leading the others. They reached the cliffs just as the fire licked at the edges of the forest, the flames roaring like a hungry beast. The herd scrambled onto the rocky outcrop, the cool wind from the open sky offering a brief reprieve from the searing heat. But the fire wasn't the only threat. Below the cliffs lay a dense ravine, and across it, salvation, an open field untouched by flames. But to reach it, they would have to cross a rickety, weather-worn wooden bridge. Ash felt his breath catch in his throat. The bridge had always been a risk, its structure weakened by years of storms. And now, with the fire so close, there was no telling if it would hold. "It's our only way out," Ember said, her voice trembling, but resolute. Ash nodded, his gaze shifting to the herd. They looked to him now, their eyes filled with desperation and fragile hope. He turned to Ember, his voice steady despite his fear. "I'll test it first. If it holds, we'll send the foals across." "And if it doesn't?" Ember asked. Ash hesitated. "Then I'll find another way." Without another word, Ash stepped onto the bridge, his hooves echoing against the wooden planks. Each step felt like a gamble with fate, but he pressed on, the weight of the herd's survival driving him forward. Behind him, the flames roared louder, and the first sparks began to leap onto the cliffs. The fire raged behind them, a relentless force turning the once familiar forest into an inferno of destruction. Ash's hooves trembled against the old wooden planks of the bridge, which groaned under his weight. Below, the ravine stretched deep and jagged, its rocky floor a grim reminder of what awaited if the bridge failed. The herd stood at the edge of the cliffs, their eyes fixed on Ash with a mix of hope and terror. The heat from the fire pressed against his back, but Ash forced himself to move forward. Each step was deliberate, testing the strength of the worn wood. The boards creaked ominously, but they held. When he reached the middle of the bridge, he paused, his ears swiveling to listen for any signs of collapse. "It's holding," he called back, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Bring the foals first, one at a time." The herd hesitated, their fear evident in their stamping hooves and nervous snorts. Ember stepped forward, her fiery mane tousled by the hot winds. "I'll bring them," she said, her voice resolute. Without waiting for a reply, she nudged a trembling foal forward, guiding him onto the bridge. Ash stayed in the center, his presence a reassurance to the foal as the little one took shaky steps across the precarious structure. The wood groaned louder with the added weight, but Ash didn't let his anxiety show. "You're doing great," he said softly, encouraging the foal. "Just keep moving." When the foal reached the other side, Ash nudged him onto solid ground before looking back. Ember was already guiding the next foal onto the bridge, her movements careful but swift. The process repeated, each crossing bringing a small wave of relief, but also increasing the strain on the fragile bridge. By the time the last of the foals had crossed, the fire had reached the edge of the cliffs. Ash could feel the heat searing his coat, the air growing thick with ash and smoke. Granite, leading the adult horses, limped toward the bridge with determination etched across his weathered face. "Go, Granite," Ash urged. "We don't have time." The old stallion hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his injury. But then he stepped onto the bridge, his movements deliberate and heavy. The wood beneath him creaked and splintered, sending small shards falling into the ravine below. Ash's heart pounded as he watched Granite inch forward. The bridge sagged dangerously, and for a moment, Ash feared it wouldn't hold. But just as Granite reached the middle, a loud snap echoed through the air. One of the planks cracked beneath his hind hoof, causing him to stumble. "No!" Ash bolted forward, his hooves pounding against the weakening structure. He reached Granite in a heartbeat, pressing his shoulder against the older stallion to steady him. "Keep moving." Granite nodded, his breath labored as he pushed forward. Ash stayed close, his muscles tense as the bridge groaned under their combined weight. When they finally reached the other side, the herd erupted in relieved neighs. But their relief was short-lived. The fire's heat had intensified, and the flames leapt across the cliffs, licking at the edge of the bridge. The dry wood ignited instantly, sending plumes of black smoke spiraling into the sky. Ash turned back, his chest tightening as he realized the bridge was now ablaze, cutting off any chance of retreat. "We're trapped," one of the mares said, her voice trembling. No, we're not, Ash said firmly, stepping to the front of the group. He glanced at the open field beyond the ravine, their only haven from the fire. We made it across and we're not stopping now. Follow me. The herd began to move again, their fear propelling them forward. But Ash's mind raced as he considered their next challenge. The fire wasn't the only danger. The open field would provide temporary safety, but the herd needed water and shelter, both of which were scarce in the barren plains. As they reached the field, Ember caught up to Ash, her breathing heavy, but her eyes sharp. "What now?" she asked. "We can't stay here for long." Ash scanned the horizon, his gaze settling on a distant ridge. It was faint, barely visible through the haze of smoke, but he recognized it, a place called Stone Hollow. The hollow was a natural basin surrounded by rocky walls, with a freshwater spring at its center. It was their best chance for survival. "We head to Stone Hollow," Ash said, his voice resolute. "It's a long run, but it's safe." Ember nodded, but her expression was laced with concern. "The foals are exhausted. Granite won't make it without rest." Ash glanced back at the herd. The younger horses were stumbling, their legs trembling from the effort of the climb and the harrowing escape. Granite stood at the rear, his injured leg dragging with each step. Ash's heart ached for them, but he knew staying in the open was too dangerous. "We'll rest at the base of the ridge," Ash decided, "but only for a short time. The fire isn't the only threat out here." As if on cue, a distant howl cut through the air. The herd froze, their ears swiveling toward the sound. Ash's blood ran cold. Wolves, they were too far away to be in immediate danger, but the predators would smell the herd's fear and exhaustion. They wouldn't wait long to strike. Ash turned to Ember, his jaw set. "We need to move faster." The mare nodded, determination flaring in her eyes. Together they pushed the herd forward, their steps quickening despite their exhaustion. The howls echoed again, closer this time, spurring the herd into a desperate trot. As the ridge grew closer, Ash felt a glimmer of hope. Stone Hollow was within reach, but deep down, he knew the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. The ridge loomed ahead, its rocky surface shimmering faintly in the heat radiating from the wildfire. The herd moved as one, their hooves pounding the scorched ground in a rhythm of desperation and resolve. Every step brought them closer to Stone Hollow, a place that Ash hoped would provide the safety they so desperately needed. Ash led the way, his dark coat streaked with soot and sweat. Beside him, Ember kept pace, her breathing heavy but steady. Behind them, the rest of the herd followed, their heads low with exhaustion. The foals stumbled often, their mothers urging them forward with gentle nudges. At the rear, Granite struggled to keep up, his injured leg dragging like a dead weight. The howls of the wolves grew louder, a haunting chorus that sent shivers down Ash's spine. They were closing in. The predators had caught the scent of the herd and were undoubtedly tracking them through the open plains. Ash quickened his pace, his heart pounding, as he scanned the horizon for any sign of the hollow. "We're close," Ember said, her voice breaking through the tense silence. "I can see the edge of the ridge." Ash followed her gaze, relief washing over him as he spotted the faint outline of Stone Hollow in the distance. But their relief was short-lived. The howls morphed into snarls, and Ash turned to see the shadows of wolves emerging from the haze. Their sleek bodies glided across the ground like phantoms, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger. "They're here," Ember said, her voice tight with fear. Ash felt a surge of adrenaline. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice carrying over the thundering hooves of the herd. "We have to make it to the hollow." The herd broke into a gallop, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of imminent danger. The wolves gave chase, their lithe bodies moving with terrifying speed. Ash stayed at the front, his muscles burning as he pushed himself harder, his mind racing for a plan. Stone Hollow was less than a mile away, but the wolves would reach them before they made it. He needed to buy the herd more time. "Ember," he said sharply, slowing his pace to run alongside her. "Take the herd, and don't stop until you're inside the hollow." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide with alarm. "I'll hold them off," Ash replied, his voice firm. "They'll follow me if I break away." "No," Ember protested, her voice rising. "You can't." "I have to," Ash interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They won't stop unless we distract them." Before Ember could say another word, Ash veered sharply to the left, his powerful strides carrying him away from the herd. The wolves, drawn by his sudden movement, changed course, their snarls growing louder as they pursued him. Ash's heart thundered in his chest as he glanced back, counting at least 5 wolves in the pack. Their sleek bodies moved with unnerving precision, their jaws snapping as they closed the distance. He pushed himself harder, his hooves pounding the ground in a desperate rhythm. The herd disappeared over the ridge, and Ash felt a flicker of relief. They would make it to the hollow, but his own chances of survival were rapidly dwindling. Ash led the wolves toward a cluster of boulders, his mind racing for a way to outmaneuver them. The terrain grew rougher, the jagged rocks forcing him to slow his pace. The wolves took advantage, closing the gap with frightening speed. One of them lunged, its sharp teeth snapping inches from Ash's hind leg. He kicked out instinctively, his powerful hoof striking the wolf's shoulder. The predator yelped and fell back, but the others were undeterred. Ash zigzagged through the rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he searched for an escape route. He spotted a narrow crevice between 2 boulders and darted toward it, his body barely fitting through the gap. The wolves skidded to a halt, their snarls echoing in the confined space. They couldn't follow him through the crevice, but Ash knew it was only a temporary reprieve. He needed to get back to the herd before the wolves found another way around. Climbing out of the crevice, Ash found himself on a steep incline that led back toward the ridge. He could see the entrance to Stone Hollow in the distance, the rocky walls offering a natural barrier against the wildfire and predators. He pushed himself forward, his legs trembling with exhaustion. As he crested the ridge, Ash's heart soared. The herd was gathered inside the hollow, their bodies pressed together in the shade of the rock walls. Ember stood at the entrance, her eyes scanning the horizon. When she spotted Ash, her face lit up with relief. "You're alive!" she cried, rushing toward him. Ash stumbled as he reached the hollow, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. Ember pressed her shoulder against his, steadying him as they entered the shelter. The rest of the herd nickered softly, their voices filled with gratitude and relief. But the wolves weren't far behind. Ash turned to face the entrance, his body tensing as he heard the low growls of the approaching pack. The wolves had followed his scent trail and were now gathered outside the hollow, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. They couldn't enter easily. The narrow entrance was a bottleneck, but they wouldn't give up without a fight. "We can't stay here if they attack," Ember said, her voice trembling. "We won't," Ash replied, his eyes never leaving the wolves. "We'll fight!" Granite stepped forward, his injured leg dragging, but his posture defiant. "You won't fight alone." Ash glanced at the older stallion, a mix of gratitude and concern flickering in his eyes. "You've done enough, Granite. Let me handle this." Granite snorted. "I may be old, but I'm not useless." The wolves began to inch closer, their growls deepening. Ash pawed the ground, his muscles coiled like a spring. Ember stood at his side, her fiery spirit unbroken despite the odds. Together they prepared to defend their herd, knowing that their survival depended on their strength and unity. And as the first wolf lunged into the hollow, Ash charged forward, his heart blazing with the determination to protect his family. The first wolf leapt through the narrow entrance, its snarling jaws snapping at the air. Ash met it head-on, his powerful hooves striking the predator square in the chest. The wolf yelped in pain and fell back, its body tumbling onto the rocky ground outside the hollow. Another wolf immediately replaced it, its eyes burning with feral hunger. Ember was at Ash's side in an instant, her hooves lashing out with fierce precision. She landed a blow to the wolf's flank, sending it staggering back. But the pack was relentless. More wolves gathered at the entrance, their snarls echoing through the hollow as they pressed forward in a chaotic frenzy. "We can't let them break through," Ash shouted, his voice rising over the clamor. He glanced at Granite, who stood at the rear of the herd, shielding the foals and weaker horses. The old stallion's posture was tense, his injured leg trembling, but his gaze was unwavering. "Hold the line," Granite bellowed, though his voice carrying the weight of authority despite his injury. "Protect the herd at all costs." Ash and an Ember pushed forward, their bodies forming a barrier between the wolves and the rest of the herd. The narrow entrance worked to their advantage, forcing the wolves to attack one at a time. But each skirmish left Ash's muscles burning and his breath coming in ragged gasps. One particularly large wolf lunged at Ash, its teeth grazing his shoulder as he dodged. Pain flared through his body, but he retaliated with a swift kick that sent the wolf crashing into the rocky wall. Ember darted forward, her hooves pounding against the ground as she drove another wolf back into the shadows. "They're not giving up!" Ember shouted, her voice laced with frustration and exhaustion. "What do we do?" Ash didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, searching for a way to end the standoff before the wolves overwhelmed them. He glanced around the hollow, his eyes landing on a pile of loose rocks near the entrance. An idea began to form, and he turned to Ember, his voice urgent. "Help me with the rocks," he said, gesturing toward the pile. "We can block the entrance." Ember hesitated, glancing at the wolves snapping at the edge of the hollow. "Are you sure it'll hold?" "It's our best chance," Ash replied. "We don't have time to argue." Together they lunged toward the pile of rocks, using their hooves to shove the loose stones into the narrow opening. The wolves snarled and clawed at the barrier, their bodies pressing against the stones as Ash and Ember worked frantically to seal the entrance. "Faster," Ash urged, sweat dripping from his coat as he pushed another rock into place. Granite limped forward to assist, his teeth clenched against the pain in his leg. "Keep at it," he said, his voice steady despite his labored breathing. "We're almost there." The wolves howled in frustration as the gap grew smaller, the pile of rocks forming an impassable wall. One particularly determined wolf managed to wedge its head through a small opening, its snapping jaws inches from Ash's face. He reared back, bringing his hooves down in a crushing blow that sent the wolf retreating with a pained yelp. Finally, with one last heave, the entrance was sealed. The wolves clawed at the barrier, their growls reverberating through the hollow, but the rocks held firm. Ash stumbled back, his chest heaving as he surveyed their work. The herd stood behind him, their eyes wide with fear, and exhaustion. "It's done," Ember said, her voice barely above a whisper. She collapsed onto the ground, her sides heaving as she caught her breath. "We did it!" Ash nodded, his legs trembling beneath him. But even as the immediate danger subsided, he knew their ordeal was far from over. The wolves wouldn't give up so easily, and the fire still raged in the distance, its smoke casting an ominous haze over the hollow. The herd settled into a tense silence, their bodies pressed together for comfort and warmth. The foals huddled close to their mothers, their small forms trembling with fear. Granite lay down near the center of the hollow, his injured legs stretched out awkwardly. Despite his exhaustion, his eyes remained sharp as he surveyed the group. Ash stood at the edge of the hollow, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The wolves' howls had faded, but he knew they were still out there, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Ember approached him, her movements slow and deliberate. "You should rest," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of concern. "You've done enough." Ash shook his head. "Not yet. They're still out there. If we let our guard down, we're finished." Ember sighed, her eyes searching his face. "You can't carry the weight of the herd alone, Ash. That's why we're all here, to help each other." Ash turned to her, his expression softening. "I know, but someone has to make sure we survive this." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared responsibility hanging between them. Then Ember stepped closer, her voice firm but gentle. "You've done more than enough, Ash. If anyone can lead us through this, it's you." Ash's gaze flickered with gratitude, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the horizon, his thoughts racing. Stone Hollow had given them temporary safety, but it wouldn't last. They needed a plan, a way to escape the wolves and find a permanent refuge. As the first light of dawn broke over the hollow, a faint sound reached Ash's ears, the gentle trickle of water. His heart leapt as he realized what it meant. The spring at the center of the hollow was still flowing, its waters untouched by the fire of the wolves. "Water!" Ash called out, his voice breaking the morning silence. "The spring's still here." The herd stirred, their heads lifting as the sound of the spring reached their ears. Foals and mothers rushed toward the water, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they drank deeply from the cool, clear stream. Granite and Ember followed, their movements slow but purposeful. As Ash watched the herd drink, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. Stone Hollow wasn't just a temporary refuge, it was a lifeline. The spring would sustain them, and the rocky walls would protect them from the fire and the wolves. But Ash knew they couldn't stay forever. The fire would eventually burn itself out, and the wolves would grow bolder. They needed a plan to ensure their survival, a way to reclaim their freedom and find a new home. And as the sun rose higher, bathing the hollow in golden light, Ash made a silent promise. He would do whatever it took to keep his family safe. The morning light painted the hollow in shades of gold, and for the first time in days, the herd felt a glimmer of peace. The spring's cool waters refreshed their tired bodies, and the rocky walls offered a respite from the ever-present dangers outside. But Ash knew the calm wouldn't last. The wolves were still out there, and the fire's smoldering embers were a constant threat. Stone Hollow had become a sanctuary, but it couldn't be their forever home. They needed to move on before the predators returned or the fire's path changed. Ash stood at the edge of the hollow, scanning the horizon for signs of danger. Ember joined him, her fiery mane catching the sunlight. "They're quiet," she said, her voice low. "Too quiet." "They're waiting," Ash replied, his tone grim. "They'll come back when we least expect it." Granite hobbled up beside them, his uninjured legs still dragging, but his spirit unbroken. "What's the plan, Ash?" the old stallion asked. There was no challenge in his tone, only trust. Granite had passed the mantle of leadership to Ash, and now the younger stallion carried it with pride. "We head west," Ash said after a pause. "The fires burned out most of the forest behind us, but the plains beyond the ridge should be clear. If we can make it to the river, we'll have water, food, and space to recover." Granite nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "It's a long journey. The foals and weaker horses will need help." "We'll take it slow," Ash assured him. "But we can't stay here. The wolves won't wait forever." The herd set out at midday, their spirits lifted by the promise of safety. Ash and Ember led the way, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for danger. Granite took up the rear, his presence a steady reassurance to the others. The foals, though still tired, moved with newfound determination, their mothers guiding them gently. The first part of the journey was uneventful. The burned forest gave way to open plains. The grass is charred but beginning to recover. Small streams crossed their path, offering moments of respite and hydration. The herd's spirits began to rise, and for the first time in days there was laughter among the younger horses. But the wolves had not forgotten them. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plains, the eerie howl of the pack echoed once more. The herd froze, their ears swiveling toward the sound. Ash's heart sank. The wolves were closer than he had hoped. "They're tracking us," Ember said, her voice tense. "They're waiting for the right moment." Ash turned to the herd, his expression resolute. "We keep moving. Stay close together and don't panic. We're stronger as a group." The herd pressed on, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. The howls grew louder, and soon Ash caught sight of the pack in the distance. The wolves moved like shadows across the plains, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They were waiting for a weakness, a straggler, a moment of chaos. As night fell, the herd reached the edge of a wide river. Its waters flowed fast and deep, sparkling under the moonlight. But the river was both a blessing and a curse. It offered a natural barrier against the wolves, but crossing it would be dangerous, especially for the foals and weaker horses. Ash turned to Ember, his mind racing. "We need to cross." "The current's too strong," Ember said, her voice laced with worry. "The foals won't make it." "We don't have a choice," Ash replied. He glanced back at the approaching wolves. The pack had slowed, their movements cautious as they studied the herd's next move. "If we stay, they'll pick us off one by one." Granite stepped forward, his voice steady. "We'll form a line. The strongest horses will cross first and break the current. The others will follow in the wake." Ash nodded, the plan solidifying in his mind. "Ember, take the foals. I'll stay at the rear with Granite." The herd began to move, their hooves splashing into the cold water. The strongest horses waded in first, their bodies bracing against the current. The foals followed, their mothers guiding them carefully. Ember stayed close, her presence a beacon of encouragement. Ashen and Brannet held their ground at the riverbank, their eyes locked on the wolves. The pack had stopped just short of the water, their snarls echoing through the night. Ash knew they wouldn't risk the river. Not yet. But the predators didn't need to attack directly. They only needed to wait for the weakest to falter. The last of the herd reached the far side of the river, their bodies drenched but safe. Ash turned to Granite, his voice urgent. Your turn. Granite hesitated, his gaze sweeping over the pack. I'll be right behind you, Ash. Go. No, Ash said firmly. We crossed together. Granite nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Together they stepped into the river, the icy water biting at their legs. The current was strong, pulling at their bodies with relentless force. But Ash and Granite pressed on, their movements synchronized as they pushed toward the far bank. Behind them, the wolves paced along the riverbank, their howls turning into frustrated snarls. The pack wouldn't risk the water. Not tonight. When Ash and Granite finally reached the other side, the herd erupted in relieved neighs. The foals bounded forward, their small bodies pressing against Ash in gratitude. Ember stepped up, her eyes shining with pride. You did it, she said softly. You led us to safety. Ash looked around at the herd, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. They had survived fire, wolves, and countless other dangers. Together they had overcome impossible odds. The river stretched behind them, its waters a glimmering barrier that separated them from the past. Ahead, the plains opened up into a vast, untouched horizon. It was a place where the herd could rebuild, where foals could grow, and where they could finally find peace. Ash turned to Granite, his voice steady. Thank you for trusting me. Granite chuckled, his eyes warm. You've earned it, Ash. The herd is yours now. As the first rays of dawn broke over the plains, Ash stood tall at the front of the herd, his dark coat glistening in the light. Ember stepped beside him, her fiery mane glowing like the rising sun. Together they led the herd into the unknown, their hearts filled with hope and the promise of a brighter future.